So we have a pretty full program today, and I do want us to get started as quickly as we can. My name is David Harris. I'm with the Fair Housing Center of Greater Boston. That was my old job. I'm with the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice. And on behalf of Tomiko Brown-Nagin and Dean Manning, welcome to Harvard Law School. Today's event is part of our ongoing rollout of the Houston Marshall Plan for Community Justice. We believe that rebuilding our cities in the face of decades of neglect and disinvestment must be multidimensional. Last week, we took on issues of reform to the justice system, and this week, we explore issues related to what we call economic stability. We recognize that the remarkable new array of opportunities known as the sharing or gig economy is uniquely premised on creating opportunity by linking people through technology. And we ask, whose fair share? Indeed, we often focus on access and opportunity in the context of justice reform, and there are signs that this new economy presents unique and promising pathways to economic stability to people returning from incarceration or trying to avoid it. We are also mindful, however, that absent real, concerted, determined effort, the new economy could reproduce the inequities of the old. Thank you. Our goal is that we may walk away from today with a sense of the range of issues embraced by this new economy presents and ideas for how to avoid repeating or exacerbating old problems. We have a remarkable array of panelists with us today and realize there's no way we can do justice to them in the short time we have. But this is just a beginning of our look into the new economy. Don't look up here because there's not another slide coming. People are so trained, you know, this is just a placeholder. Come on. But I'm looking at the paper, that's okay. We'll be having additional events here and elsewhere in the country, and we'll provide a summary document to be made available for comment. We'll have two panels, each running about 35 minutes plus time for questions, followed by a reception in Milstein East, which is 2 doors down. Before beginning, I have to thank a group of wonderful people who helped make this happen. As always, I give thanks and praise to my colleague, Kelly Garvin, who works tirelessly and always pleasantly with a smile on her face. And I want to give special thanks to her. We often forget, excuse me, for her design. She designs our posters and does a remarkable job under duress. I also have to give thanks to Amy Meltzer and Jeff Tigner. I would ask them to stand up. Yeah, no, see, I got to. Okay. So that was quick. That was to be expected. Both of whom volunteer with us and give their time to us without remuneration. Amy has been especially helpful in keeping this project organized and trying to keep me on track despite the chaos that surrounds me and our efforts. Jeff's knowledge and contacts have been invaluable in getting us here, and I must also thank Sharon Stanberry from Congresswoman Yvette Clarke's office. We had hoped to have the Congresswoman do a keynote. She wasn't able to, but Sharon kind of helped us out along the way to identify additional panelists and get us through this. Finally, I want to thank our two co-sponsors, Lyft and the Civic Engagement Fund. And in my notes, I say, although we neglected to put the CEF on the poster, Kelly, in her miracle of miracles, did in fact add it here. And that's why I want to leave this up, because they have been invaluable in providing support for our effort. And now we begin. Our first panel will be moderated by Shawn Bohen, and our second by Jeff Tigner. We have agreed to eschew the kind of standard, time-consuming long bios, but I have to say that Shawn has decades of experience in interdisciplinary collaboration in mission-driven organizations, leading up to her current position as National Director for Strategic Growth and Impact at Europe. Jeff, whose day job is as an attorney in a federal agency, to be unnamed, has been our special advisor on law and technology for 2 years and brings encyclopedic knowledge of most, if not all, things technological and an equally wide set of contacts. So please join me now in welcoming Shawn and our first panel.
I'm Shawn Bohen, and it's a thrill to be here with all of you, back at an old stomping ground for me at Harvard. And I'm particularly inspired to get to spend a little time with these four extraordinary human beings, and on a topic which I know is of great interest to all of you, hence you're taking a couple of hours on what's already probably been a very long Monday for you. So as we get started, when I was thinking a little bit about this conversation that we wanted to have, it struck me that one of the interesting things as I think about the current economic reality that we're living in is the degree to which I tend to flip kind of and think about different kinds of my identities when I'm thinking about these kinds of questions. So I think about myself as a worker. I think about myself as an employer, because I'm also a leader of an organization. We employ a lot of people. And I think about myself as a citizen. And I think about all three of those, somewhat in an intermingled way. But when I think about these issues, I potentially can have a different point of view depending on which of those I'm standing in. And so my request for the four of you and us this evening is to think a little bit about, because we're all here with, repping the organizations that we currently work for, but we're also here really thinking a little bit about the world that we're living in and the world that we're responsible for creating. And so I'd love it if we can be mindful about that. And as you're thinking about what you're sharing, think about, what challenges you when you're thinking about those different hats? Is that all right? Okay, everybody's in, good. So we've got a really interesting, diverse group of folks here from different organizations with different perspectives, although I think they all bring big heart and extraordinary brains to this work. On my far left, I have David King from Airbnb, and to his right, Stephanie Mash Sykes from the African American Mayors Association, and then Joe, I'm not going to get this right, Okpaku.
Very good.
From Lyft, and Susan Winterberg from Business for Social Responsibility. So one of the things I'd love to start out with, guys, and if you could just sort of start with this is, I'm curious, and we can come straight down the line, or someone can pop up if they want, I'm curious, with all those three hats that I talked about, what's keeping you up at night as you worry and/or as you are inspired about the opportunities that are ahead of us in this extraordinary, fast-moving reality of this big shift in terms of work? And what's worrying you? What's causing you to lose sleep? Or if for those of you who travel a lot, I just heard San Francisco, DC, and Boston in like the last 6 hours or whatever. So you might not be sleeping at all if you're traveling that much. But I'm curious, what's worrying you?
Well, thank you first off. As you talk about those different hats and the work that I do is really, those hats are all one. Right? I do the work that I do because of my own life experiences. Right? So I don't go to work and put on a different hat as it relates to promoting diversity within my organization and forget about who I am and where I'm from. Mm-hmm. So that's really kind of where I get my grounding. But what's keeping me up is pretty much everything, right? On any given day, having a platform that's in 192 countries around the world and bringing millions of people together, things are going to go bump in the night. And sometimes those things make it to the media and the press, and sometimes they don't. But the bottom line is they affect the work that I do, undoubtedly. But there are still things in the ecosystem that still keep me awake too, right? You got manifestos, you've got rampant instances of sexual harassment and discrimination in the workspace. Like every day those things are real, whether they're at Airbnb or somewhere else. And it's my job and the job of our leaders in the organization to address those. And that's internal. Going back to the external, when there's that situation in Amsterdam where there's a guest on our platform that's wronged, that keeps me up at night. When something happens in the White House that may or may not be relevant to the work that I do, it still could be a personal thing, but it could also be a professional thing. So, frankly, everything, which is probably the worst answer ever, but it's true.
Great way to get us started. Gosh, forbid we would have any few worries in the current world we're living in.
Sure. Hi, again, I'm Stephanie Mash Sykes. I'm the Executive Director of the African American Mayors Association. There are 500 African American mayors across the country. We engage with approximately over 100 of them throughout the year. And so for me, as an African American woman, what I am worried about right now is, as David mentioned, what's going on in the halls of Congress, what's being said by our president, and how do we still get the work done? our mayors have to fill the potholes. They have to keep the schools open. They have to prepare and recover from disasters. So regardless of what gridlock is going on in Washington, they still have to find a way to make a way. And although our organization partnered very closely with the last administration, I can't say that that's the same for 45 as it was for 44. And so what keeps me up at night is how do we make sure our cities have the resources we need? How do we prioritize our issues so that our voices have an impact on the national stage? And as we're talking about the sharing economy and we're partnering with organizations and companies like Airbnb and Uber and Lyft across the country, we're worried about how to be responsive today while also preparing for automation and making sure communities of color are not left behind. So those are some of the things that keep me up and keep members of my organization up at night.
My name is Joseph Okpaku. I head up the government relations team for Lyft. Thank you very much for allowing me to be here. And I'm going to piggyback somewhat on the two prior answers. First of all, as you mentioned, there's tends to be a lot of things that keep me up at night. I kind of share that with David. But in the context of this discussion today, I think the intersection between industry and government, and that can take a couple of different shapes or forms. If you are running a government relations shop for a company, then engagement with elected officials is something that's necessary. But at the same time, as a young company, we are trying to make sure that we're being a socially conscious and socially responsible company, and trying to figure out how to walk the line of speaking out on some of your core values and how they relate to some of the things that are going on in the country right now. At the same time, making sure that you are able to perform your core function. We believe that what we do is hugely invaluable to a lot of both passengers and drivers across the country. And that's our ultimate responsibility is to that community. So making sure that we are able to both, be a corporate responsible corporation, but at the same time, engage with those who we might disagree with in order to make sure that we're doing what we believe is best for our driver and passenger community is difficult. In addition to that, there's a very, I think, fine line, and this is coming up a lot more and more these days, about the role of regulation in emerging industries. And obviously there is a very key and critical role that legislators and regulators have to play with respect to that. And it's a really, I think, sensitive balance. Tip too far one way and you're ultimately inhibiting the value that a platform can bring, whether it's an Airbnb or a Lyft or any other sort of sharing economy platform can bring to the community. Tip the other way and there's not enough accountability going on. So that's a very interesting dance that we have to do all across the country on a daily basis, and those are the types of things that tend to keep me up at night.
Susan.
Sorry.
My name is Susan Winterberg, and I lead the Inclusive Economies team at Business for Social Responsibility, BSR. And BSR is a network of about 250 multinational companies, so mostly the big global brands, for their sustainability and corporate social responsibility teams. And what keeps me up at night? It's sort of a mixture. When I first came to BSR was right before the election last year. So I came really thinking about the future of work. So my background before I actually came from Harvard, and I researched what happened to people that lost their jobs during past major transitions of technology, such as like when we had globalization and automation and other industries, and the technology waves of outsourcing back in the 1990s. So I was really interested in trying to understand, how do we get companies ready? So it's sort of a mix of, I think about that a lot, of how to actually get companies engaged with partners and regulators, thinking about these big changes that are coming in the future of work and things like autonomous vehicles, artificial intelligence and automation, combined with, because we're a membership network, I spent a lot of time dealing with companies' current challenges, which very similar to what we heard from Lyft and Airbnb, thinking about how can companies respond and how do they use a voice. So as some of you who know the climate change field may know, there's a very active corporate presence on environmental issues, and there has been for quite some time. But now, for the first time, we're really starting to see companies mobilize around social and inclusion issues, which you saw earlier this year when over 100 companies came out to speak out against the executive order on immigration. And I think this is a trend that we're going to see going forward, and it's something new, and it's challenging, and it keeps me up a lot of nights now.
Well, we certainly have a lot of topics we can go deep on across this extraordinary panel, as I assumed would be true. I'm curious, just sort of hearkening back to a couple of the themes. One of the really interesting questions as I think about these issues right now, and the real shift of the sort of nature of employment, and certainly in both Airbnb and Lyft, we have these really interesting examples of a real shift about what constitutes work and flexibility in work and a whole host of questions. And we have this really rapidly changing, technology scene and the very fast upon us, reality of artificial intelligence and what's going to happen. And so I'm just curious, maybe you guys could, one of you could start, or both of you could start on this, is how you think about, historically we used to think about employers as the ones who invested in ensuring folks had the skills that they needed to be able to participate. And the question of who's going to make sure we're continuing to skill, and in the case of older workers, upskill or reskill. And I'm just curious how you all, in your sort of corporate conversations internally, are thinking about that, either in terms of your own responsibility or partnerships you have, or how you're imagining that happens and gets paid for in the current world that we're in as you guys look ahead.
Sure. So I guess I'll go first on that one. It's a great question, and it's something that we've given a lot of thought to. I think as a starting point, just to kind of set the foundation for what I'm about to say, I think it's important to remember, well, let me take a step back. So obviously there's a conversation that's going on about the nature of gig economy workers. And there was a judge in California who about a year, maybe 2 years ago, in looking at this issue, had, I think, what was a really appropriate comment, which is that essentially you are asking to take a square peg and figure out which two round holes to put it in, meaning that you have the historic employer-employee relationship, and then you have the independent contractor relationship, which I think was a really apt comment, because I think that binary analysis does tend to overlook the way the nature of work has changed. And I think it's very important to note that this is far bigger than the gig economy. The gig economy represents a very small percentage of the independent contractor group, but at the same time, it's the gig economy that I think that's bringing this issue to the forefront, which is a good thing because it's something that needs to be discussed. What's interesting about this conversation is that it does seem to be a binary conversation, and I'm not sure that's the right approach. I think that I don't personally believe that the gig economy has caused a lot of the employment ails that we're talking about, but there are employment ails that do need to be addressed. I think you could argue, and I personally believe, that the gig economy has actually helped to fill in some gaps in terms of employment, but that doesn't necessarily answer the entire question. Just as an aside, at Lyft, we've been part of a coalition that's looking at this issue very intently and trying to figure out, develop policy positions and come up with proposals, either working with people like Senator Mark Warner to address this issue. And I don't think there are any easy answers. I would say that the most important thing going forward is to recognize that, like I said, this is bigger than just the gig economy. The other thing I'll mention, though, is that the idea that there's one broad solution for an entire sector of the independent contractor sector, so subsector, is also a little bit tricky to deal with. What may be appropriate for one platform may not be appropriate for another. As an example, I know that I believe the company is Honor ultimately went to an employer-employee relationship as a platform because they realized that their customers wanted the continuity of having the same person. Let me take a step back. Honor is a app-based, kind of like a home healthcare helper platform, in case you're not aware. And they found that it was actually very important to be able to schedule and to really control the employees on their platforms, their schedules, to make sure that they could have that continuity and relationship with their customers, their clients. What may be correct for that platform may not necessarily be correct for another type of gig economy or sharing economy platform. So I don't pretend to have any quick, broad, simple answers, but it is at least a good thing, I think, that the conversation's being had. I think we just need to make sure that the conversation keeps moving in the right direction, and that the idea of a one-size-fits-all solution is probably one that's not going to work.
So it sounds like, just to recap, that the way you guys are thinking about this is in coalition and through policy and not necessarily doing things for your own workers as it relates to their education and training.
Well, that's the funny thing about about this. Number one, and this is not our own, and I'm focusing specifically on the ride-sharing industry right now. If you look at independent studies, the vast majority of drivers on a ride-sharing platform are doing this part-time. They are doing this in addition to a full-time job. So
and potentially also education. Right? Exactly,
correct. There are a lot of full-time students, a lot of teachers who do this during the summer, during their break. So based on the studies that we've seen that have been conducted, independently of us, the vast majority of people on the platform actually do not want that type of relationship. So if you are in a place where you're imposing that, are you actually imposing something that people don't want? Mm-hmm. We have been pretty loud advocates for a form of portable benefits mm-hmm. because we would love to do more in terms of training and education. The way the law is set up, though, is that the more you go down that road, the more the law is going to infer an employer-employee relationship, which we don't necessarily think is appropriate, at least as that binary, that definition is understood in the kind of the binary context of today. So that's why we're pushing for the policy stuff to try to have a little bit more of a nuanced look at the issue.
Awesome. How about you, David? What are your thoughts?
When you asked the question, the first thing that came to mind was one of my first Airbnb experiences in San Francisco. We've got hosts around the world who have multi-million-dollar homes. We have other folks who are in homes where they're using their Airbnb income to offset their taxes and other things like that, right? So I think about that latter group more in the work that I do, not to deny the fact that the other groups exist. And this host was in the Lower Haight, which is an area that's really famed in San Francisco, but has seen unreal amounts of gentrification over the years. And an African-American woman moved to San Francisco in the 70s, bought her own home back in the 70s for $30,000. Traditional San Francisco, Victorian, currently worth about $1.7 million, but yet it's actually in disrepair to some extent. And she's had a lot of people knock on her door and say, hey, we'll buy your house for you for this unreal amount of money in her own. She's on a fixed income, over 70 years old at this point. And her whole take is, no one's kicking me out of my house. And I feel that, right? So where do you go? You got $1.5 million in the pocket, but where do you go? She wants to stay in at home, and she's actually using the money that she's Airbnb-ing portion of her home to, first of all, pay for her property taxes, which are greater than her annual fixed income alone. The broken stairs in the front, the roof. So it's not the prettiest Airbnb in the world, but it's the absolute best experience I've ever had on the platform. A person who truly understands how to host, how to connect with the community, and how to make people in her home feel at home. And that, to me, is my day-to-day norm, but not saying it's the platform norm. So that's me working with folks in the organization, going to communities that are quite often Black and brown communities where there aren't hotels, right? So there's like this hotel Airbnb, you go to Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, and find me a hotel. You can find a lot of Black and brown folks, though, right? People who have family come into town, people who want people to stay in their communities and go to their restaurants and their bodegas, et cetera, et cetera. Like, that's my thought process. And trying to close the gap between those communities and bring knowledge to those communities as it relates to what our platform can do for them, irrespective of all the noise they might hear out in the press. That's what's important to me. And there's also that legal piece of making sure that we provide the tools necessary to uplift those folks without creating a gray space of this employer-employee relationship. Yeah.
So how's that going internally with your colleagues, as you said, as you're taking your personal experience of what's powerful about what you're doing and helping your colleagues see? Is that going well?
Yeah, in theory, absolutely. So our mission is about belonging, right? So when the mission was crafted years ago, was creating a world where anyone can belong anywhere, right? And that's tough because that's never the case, honestly, right? There are folks who don't have the means to belong at all in certain spaces, and that's unfortunate. But internally, we are trying to move towards a direction where we actually realize that mission, right? So about 1.5 years ago, give or take, we had quite a few issues on our platform regarding racism, homophobia, sexism, et cetera. And internally, when we sat down, we said, what are we going to do about this? We're not going to eradicate racism from the face of the earth, but we can create an authentic platform where you opt into our platform, and if you don't agree to our standards, we don't want you. Right, and that's a lot of credit card companies do it all the time, right? You sign off on some kind of agreement that you don't read whatsoever, right? So we put that out there, but like, what's the next step when people just check the box? Then we so-called police the situation to make sure that you're making unbiased decisions. And when things do go bump in the night and they're discriminatory in nature based on the work that I do, we kick you off our platform, right? So we brought in data scientists, engineers, people who know stuff that I don't know. Legal folks, I happen to be an attorney, but I don't know much about that world anymore either. Public policy, communications, designers, the marketing team. We had a Super Bowl commercial, and they came in and said, what do we want to tell the world? Like, brought everyone into the conversation and said, this is who we are as a company. So going back to your question of internal, and internally speaking, if you're not on board, I'm not sure we want you here either. And we can't tell hosts and guests that we don't want them, but have employees who have this biased view of the world. So it's been a heck of a year and a half, and I think we're definitely moving in the right direction. We're not there yet by any means.
Interesting. Go ahead, Steph.
So thank you for the corporate perspective. I think it's important, and in full disclosure, my organization works with Airbnb, and have kudos to all the stuff you've done in response to anti-discrimination and Charlottesville and all of those wonderful things and disaster recovery. But I do want to also frame the conversation around what are the other side. There's all these benefits, but for communities of color, even for the grandma who is staying in her home, who is there to tell grandma, well, if you get $2,000 in income, you're not going to get your Medicaid benefits. You're going to have tax issues. And these are the things not necessarily from a corporate perspective, but from a elected official, community organizer, NGO perspective that we have to also align with the benefits, because we'll have the short-term benefit of keeping her in her home. But what are we doing outside of that? How are we making sure she has health care? How are we making sure the young person has health care? If we go back to the whole employer versus independent contractor conversation, I think about it in two buckets. Why would I want an employer-employee relationship? And I look at it as benefits and protections. How can companies help on the benefit side in the public discourse about universal income, portable 401ks, portable health care, and then what are the protections as an employee that I would receive? And so those are the things that we can kind of identify versus just putting a bucket of employer-employee versus independent contractor, and how are we working with our community leaders to make sure those protections are in place. But I definitely agree that there are opportunities in the community for in the gig economy. I think I always say this, that the African American community has always been a side hustle economy. How many cousins have an extra job? My grandmother had roomers. This was 50 to 60 years ago, before Airbnb and before Craigslist made it possible. So while there are extraordinary opportunities for our community and extraordinary opportunities for economic development in our cities, we also have to understand that there are some unintended consequences, and how are we communicating that, and how are we solving for that so these communities aren't left out, and instead that we're bringing them along.
So Stephanie, when you think about the range of issues that you brought up, and you think about the who needs to be involved and how to partner effectively in a particular city, in a particular community, across the landscape of for-profit, not-for-profit government, around the social welfare of everyone in the community. How are you thinking about, again, going from the sort of earlier way in which we sort of imagined, not that it worked for everyone, as we know, the contract of employment. Where are you seeing pockets of it working? Do you have an architecture in your head of like what the new kind of contract should be?
I think the new contract should empower communities by educating them about opportunities. I think the new contract should also incorporate a lot of social responsibility or corporate responsibility on our partners that are engaging in our communities. I think for my association and other municipal associations, and there's a million trade associations in Washington, D.C., it's about communicating early and often. I think the strategy for the Airbnbs and Lyft and the corporate folks on the panel can talk to that is to super saturate the market. And then once they're here, they're super big, and it's an uphill battle to really break down some established norms in those industries, and how, Ubers and the ride sharing allowed for catching a cab in New York. But then, years into the growth and development, we also see ways for those drivers to then discriminate on those platforms. So I think it's about consistent communication with the communities, adopting a cooperative approach, talking to mayors. I'm biased, obviously, but they are where the rubber meets the road. I can't say that enough. They are, home sharing, affordability around housing, transportation. Those are hyper-local issues. So you need to be engaging with local communities, local elected leaders to really engage communities of color to make sure they're not left out.
Thank you. So Susan, you've spent time thinking about this and seen other waves of change. And I know one of the things you did in preparation for this was sort of look at the facts. Like how are we actually doing around this stuff? If we look at the sharing economy, obviously everybody's storytelling, and there's extraordinary range of stories globally and domestically around what's going on. What do we actually know about what's really happening?
Well, this is a bigger issue beyond just the digital platforms itself. So, for example, in the U.S. and in the European Union right now, it's at between 20 and 30% of people are engaged in independent work. So it's not something that's just so marginal and at the fringe. And again, not all of them are working on digital platforms like this one, but it is something, and it is growing. And in some European countries now, this is where most of the net new job creation is happening, are in these sort of what we call contingent work, which means that you don't have a regular income coming in as a condition of employment. So these can be things, for example, like independent contract work, but also people employed by temporary agencies or involuntary part-time workers. A lot of them are in the retail sector, for example, where your hours can be cut on the same day, and it will cause you to miss your rent payment and you become evicted at the end of the month. So this is a bigger problem than just in this, which is why it's so important that companies are engaging to come up with a policy framework that's going to work across all of these different types of people and their situations. And as they mentioned before, it's about 70% of people in independent work, again, not just digital platforms, but about 70% overall are there by choice. And of that group, about 30% of them don't need supplemental income. They're doing it like they're just independent contractors or freelance, usually professionals. And about 40% of those are doing it as supplemental. And then there's 30% of people that are in the gig economy that are there by necessity. And of those, only about 14% are people that are there as their primary source of income, and about 16% of people working in this economy are doing it as, it's because they can't make ends meet, but they do have a regular job. So again, I think because this is a growing trend and it is bigger than just, the companies that we see every day because they face consumers, this is happening across all sectors. It's important that we do work towards things like portable benefits pool and thinking about broader definitions of employment rather than just this binary system we have currently. So.
Any thoughts on in some ways what Susan laid out was really different demographics of folks within the work world? And I'm curious, particularly for the employers here, or for you, Stephanie, thinking about various cities across the U.S. and your mayors, the complexity of market to market as you look across this. What kind of differences are you seeing in either within the demographics of folks who do the work, and or across the various parts of the U.S., and what's different?
So it's interesting. I was listening to what Stephanie said, and it's one of the. I promise I'll get to the answer to your question. Let me take a step back for a second. One of the things that you mentioned, Stephanie, was like the issue of having to engage locally, which is something that we always try to do. At the same time, as I'm guessing you're probably aware, ride sharing has now moved to a point where it tends to be regulated more at the state level as opposed to the city level, which I know is a source of frustration to I'm guessing many of your constituents. And it's interesting because we see. From a nationwide, or in some cases an international platform, there is a challenge in terms of trying to roll out, and say in the United States, 50 different versions of the same app. That is challenging. If you add, all the cities to it, then you have, however many hundreds of versions of the same app. So that's just one of the challenges in terms of addressing that issue. But getting to your question, there are, I think, broad similarities that we do see all across the country, kind of regardless of where we are. One of the things that we are seeing in particular, and it touches on one of the things that both of you mentioned, I actually lived on the border of Bed-Stuy and Clinton Hill, area where trying to catch a taxi was very challenging when I lived there. The one thing that we're really excited about that we always predicted, but we now have the data to show that it's really happening, is actually improving access in underserved communities. And that is something that we're seeing all across the country. Here in Boston, as a matter of fact, I believe that anywhere from 35 to 40% of our rides originate in what is deemed by census tract as an underserved community. So these are things that we're seeing all over the country. The differences that we see in terms of our driver community do vary from city to city, but I think that if there's a factor that speaks to the differences in the impact that we can make in any particular market, it really does relate to the nature of the regulation there. Actually, again, using Boston or Massachusetts as an example, one of the issues that has been a hot one for the ride-sharing industry over the last couple of years has been the nature of the background checks that you do, the vetting of the driver applicant before they get onto the platform. And, stop me if I'm going too far down this road, I'll be brief on it. But one of the things that we were fighting for, because so many people who are doing this are doing this on a part-time basis and don't have the time to, let's say, stand in line at the DMV for 4 hours, 3 hours, however long it takes to get your driving abstract, don't have maybe not have the money to pay for their own insurance, may not have the wherewithal, the wherewithal of the time to jump through all the typical hoops that are associated with a full-time job, that the places where we have a more streamlined but still safe and effective basis of vetting people, I think we're able to make a bigger impact on both the community on the driver's side and the passenger side. Whereas a place, unfortunately, here like Massachusetts, where it's a bit of a more onerous process that I think vets will eliminate people who have maybe made one little minor mistake in their past, but have had a clean record ever since. Your cities like that or states like that have, I think, lessened our ability to make that impact in these communities as we have in others. So those are the sorts of things that I think help differentiate between the sort of impact that a ride-sharing or a gig economy platform can have in one place versus another place.
And so does that lead you to think there should be, particularly around, let's say, background checks, a sort of national solution that would essentially...
We know that a national solution is not realistic. This is not I don't think, well, let me not go down that road. I do think that when I said earlier that there's a fine line between making sure that you have the appropriate level of regulation, but don't want to take it to the point where you're actually inhibiting the good that it's doing. This is evidence.
Anil threading, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, this is a great example.
So I would just say that sure, we'd love to have one size fits all approach to every state. We know that's not realistic. We, at the very least, hope that jurisdictions are being thoughtful and recognizing the collateral impact of the decisions that they're making, and particularly when it comes to communities of color, when it comes to issues like background checks. I promise I'll stop talking about this in 60 seconds. Over the last couple of years, there's been a big push for fingerprint-based background checks. I actually spent 4.5 years as a prosecutor when I was in New York, and I will say that fingerprint-based background checks have their place. They are troublesome to me because, A, they tend to rely on records of arrest as opposed to records of actual disposition. Mm-hmm. Right. And if you agree with the concept that people of color are more likely to have inappropriate and unfair contact with the justice system, and if you also agree, which is not me saying it, but numerous studies have said it, including the U.S. Attorney's Office, that fingerprint-based databases don't always update the fact that a case got dismissed or that it was never brought to prosecution, then you are probably employing a system that is more likely to bar someone of color from being on the platform than not. Yep. So that's just as an example of some of the things that we try to push for to make sure that we are, that this opportunity is equal to everybody and that no one's getting unfairly blocked from taking advantage of this platform.
David, you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I kind of thought when you asked that question, I went beyond the localization piece to the globalization piece, right? And going back to your first question about what keeps you up at night, being in 192 countries, trying to figure out from whether it be a policy or legal perspective, regulatory perspective, the work that I do is pretty darn difficult, right? If you're a gay Airbnb guest in Uganda, it's actually illegal to be gay, which is utterly ridiculous. Do we encourage the host to host you even though you're putting them into legal harm? Or if you're staying in a country where it's inappropriate for a straight unmarried couple to stay in the same bed, like where does our at least our, it's not a mandate, but our thought process end and like your local rights begin, et cetera. So it's really we won't solve this anytime soon. When you scale that fast over the course of 9 years, you're going to hit challenges every day. So going back to localization work, working with the Mayor's Council, et cetera, we've done a lot of great work, but there's still a lot to be done there too, right? You brought up some things that I don't think about on a daily basis, right? So when that Airbnb host makes an extra $7,000 a year, I'm not thinking about the other ways that their life or their income might be affected by that, right? But I'm also thinking about that gay guest in Uganda, that black guest in the Ukraine, where things could potentially go bump in the night. So tying it back to the first question, that's keeping me up. Locally speaking, we've got a great team on the ground and mobilization folks who are out there doing this work for us, and we obviously contract with folks who are doing it, so I'm not going to worry about that as much. But I really am scaling at this pace provides some challenges undoubtedly.
So I think we're going to open it up to a few questions, but I wanted to I had the great pleasure, I don't know if any of you know Palak Shah, who's the Social Innovation Director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, really luminous human being. The National Domestic Workers Alliance essentially represents, I think it's about 20,000 nannies, housekeepers, and caregivers, and they recently came out with essentially a good work code, which essentially was sort of what constitutes good work. And this is, they came out with these, it's built on the foundation of 8 values. If we could create the future of work we want for ourselves, what would it look like? It would always be safe. It would be flexible around our lives, but stable enough to support them. We would have transparency into how it worked, and we would share in its prosperity. We would be heard, we would be supported, we would have room to grow, and we would be paid fairly. It's simple, really. It's good work. And there are these 8 principles: safety, stability and flexibility, transparency, shared prosperity, fair pay, inclusion and input, support and connection, growth and development. It feels to me that whether we're talking about good work and we're thinking about it from the employer standpoint or the platform standpoint, or we're thinking about it from our civic responsibilities as governors or as voters, or we're thinking about watching what's actually happening, it feels like this is a really interesting, and I wonder if anybody's heard of this code, or if it would be the kind of thing you guys might want to entertain. I just offer that as you don't need to answer now, but it's another really interesting example of a group of workers getting together and thinking about, and obviously all in the gig economy, and with a lot of different kinds of complexity in the platforms you guys run, but really interesting questions. So let's open it up. I think we probably have about maybe 10 minutes. I don't actually have a watch on, but to take any questions. And I think if you come up to the mic, we can probably hear you better because we're taping.
Hi, my name is Paula Gerstenblatt, and I'm a professor at the University of Southern Maine in School of Social Work. So my question is, what is your data source? That I found the data that you presented interesting, so I've got a few parts to my question, and maybe you can respond. There's been such a large economic shift globally in the private and public sector in terms of pensions and pay that is flat despite high productivity. So that seems to be driving it. For those who once were able to make a decent wage as part of a union and were not necessarily highly trained or educated, those options are severely limited. Including having pensions and things that are kind of like not even like a fantasy these days. So I teach a policy class, and in Portland, Maine, I'm an Airbnb host, and we registered today. Today was our registration day. And I had one of our city council people, because I teach my class at City Hall, I like to be embedded in the community. And he was talking about Airbnb and sort of aggregating the hosts who are non-owner occupied and the ones who are owner occupied. And my point to him was that if so it's all connected. So if higher education or public education were funded realistically, then someone like myself, who got a doctorate in her 50s and came out with over $100,000 in student loans, to the tune of, even on an income base at $600 a month, I might not rent that basement apartment, but I am, because it's a game changer in my life. And I was making probably $20,000 more almost 15 years ago, but chose to pursue this path. So most of my anecdotal experience, and then what I know about the economy and economic shifts and what's happening, I was a bit surprised by your data, because my experience and the data that I read would indicate that the reason people are driving and people are hosting, like myself, and those like the woman in San Francisco, I lived there for 30 years, so I'm well aware of the Bay Area and what the trends are, that people are trying to fill in gaps. A Lyft driver that I was talking to in Portland said this is their vacation money. It goes into a can. So I'm interested to know what your data source is, and maybe if anybody else has any other comments around that.
Yep, it's the McKinsey Global Institute's report on independent workers, necessity or choice. So I think they were surprised also at those results. So I think what's important to think about that is that 30% that say it's necessity, those are the people that really need support, and this is why we need to advance our social safety nets. But I think, as you heard from some of our colleagues up here from industry, they're focusing more on sort of, that it is the majority of people that are participating in this are doing it as supplemental income or as a choice. So I think it's the numbers. Yes, it is a minority, but this is a minority that needs additional policy support for them for them to have a stable life. So.
And I think I'm probably colored by being in the Bay Area, where the national median income in the Bay Area is not going to get you far. So quite a few people that I talk to who are on the platform, whether it's ride sharing or Airbnb, quite often say, I have to do this. So I don't have the McKinsey data by any means, but what I see on a day-to-day and the people that I typically interact with are folks who, this is the difference maker, as you put it, between me struggling to pay this bill and me getting over that home to pay that bill. But that's not database, it's just my day-to-day work.
Be interesting to see what the data looks like in 2 years. Sorry, Stephanie.
No problem. So I just want to add.
I think data is also a lot to say about it.
No problem. So I just want to add, this speaks to the regional component of all of this, right? So when we've looked at affordability issues, or we read about how Airbnb might be displacing folks or increasing rents in certain New Yorks or the Bay Area because folks who have money are purchasing them and renting them out, driving up prices. Those are places that were already extraordinarily expensive and out of reach for most Americans, particularly Americans of color. So I think we need to kind of segment the really high cost market so that our reaction isn't overly paternalistic and not allowing access to these platforms for communities of color that have, or any community that needs, or that are needs-based for the reasons that they engage with sharing economy platforms. So I definitely think there's a distinction there. And just backing up to something we spoke about earlier, there's definitely been a different regulatory response. When we're talking about the shared economy, we sometimes bucket the Airbnbs and the ride sharing together. But we've seen that there's 37 states that have some type of preemption for ride sharing. There's only about 3 or 4 states that have preemption for Airbnbs of the world. So there's acceptance of the hyper localness of, if that's a word, nature of home sharing platforms versus ride sharing, and so I think we do need to look at it regionally.
Well, I would say in Portland, which is not the Bay Area or New York City, we hear the very same thing. And many of those units that are non-owner occupied would not be affordable housing anyway. And we also have a very large asylum seeking and immigrant and refugee population. And many of those folks are drivers. But I guess before I part, what I would say, and I guess this is more my macro economic perspective, is that while this new economy can fill a really important gap, I don't think that in terms of the corporate responsibility piece and the social responsibility piece, that we do not include ourselves in the fact that we have to be advocates for things that are disappearing in terms of even the public sector, around pensions, around pay, that we still live in the world, and this is part of what we should be doing, whether we're being able to fill a gap as an Airbnb host or as a professor or as a taxi driver, whatever, that this is part of the trajectory, that if we don't address those issues, even if they're not in our sphere of interest, it's going to hurt everybody, and it's also interconnected now. So anyway,
So thank you. Not a question, but I think there's someone right behind you who wants to get another question.
Thank you. Todd Kaplan, Greater Boston Legal Services. So I represent and work with a lot of people where both Airbnb and Lyft and Uber and these other things have honestly helped them survive. Because, when you're over 50 and you're unemployed or whatever, some people, they're completely pushed out of the job market. And I've seen people where this has been their only survival. But I think that we also have to think about, and I'm going to push you on, when you have something come into a market at such an incredible speed and has effects. For example, we may not say that Airbnb is the gentrifier, but it's a gentrifier. It's a thing that accelerates gentrification by pulling and also taking units off the market in many communities. So it's a huge effect there that is making, for example, my clients that get displaced have to go an hour away to find affordable housing now. And then in Lyft and Uber, huge communities that had their only job for 30 years maybe was driving a taxi, completely have no job right now. So the real question is, and I want to start with Susan, is whether, when you're talking to companies about coming into a market and putting something innovative that's going to have some real consequences, how are you advising them? And I want you all to think about, well, when you're pushing things out, you can't roll back the clock, but how should you be doing it?
Thank you. That's a fantastic question. So I think what's interesting about the CSR field in general is that we tend to come into this later in the process. So when these companies are started, they're going through venture capital funding, they're going through some of their earlier development, and usually it's by the time where they reach a later stage of maturity where they're having bigger impacts in more markets, where they start to develop sustainability programs. So we saw this even with other companies like with Google, with Facebook, with the previous wave of technology companies, that sometimes usually it takes something happening, either new investors coming in, or it's a boycott from consumers or a lawsuit or something. Often that they have that moment where they're forced to sort of define their values as an organization and their responsibilities to their various stakeholders. And that's when they sort of will go back and look at some of their algorithms and things and say, okay, how can we do this better? But I think that's one of the things we're thinking about at BSR is how do you actually start to talk to companies before any of this happens? So you have to get in earlier in the process, either when they're still at the ideation stage or early in their operations in those first couple of years, and sit down with them and say, well, okay, you have an aggressive go-to-market plan, but how do you think about inclusion? What are some of the risks of this product? There's no regulation for this. What's likely to happen? What's your engagement strategy? And I think that's the next big frontier for sustainability or CSR, is how do we start earlier and sort of not wait for things to sort of get into crisis or into trouble later on before we start asking these questions.
We are near time. We need to wrap, but I wanted to know either of the three of you wanted to respond to that, or if you have a last word that you want to say before we wrap and give over to the next panel.
I can say something just really quickly, and I appreciate your thoughts as it relates to gentrification, et cetera. But part of what my job is to bring economic viability and impact to the communities that are typically gentrified, right? So we just signed on recently with a partnership with NAACP. We're going to primarily black and brown neighborhoods, educating people as to the product, right? Bringing them onto the platform, creating a kind of a profit sharing model with the NAACP that benefits the organization and the hosts. I understand that there might be a variety of factors that lead to gentrification in the community, but I don't know if any one company can answer that question, to be completely honest. If I think about the places where I've lived, San Francisco, New York, and DC, if Airbnb didn't exist, I'm not sure any of those places would be any different as it relates to cost or lack of cost at this point. I don't know. I haven't seen those studies necessarily, but I do know that internally my job is to help support the communities who would typically have to leave if they didn't have other channels of economic viability. I'd be glad to talk to you off record too.
My last comment is just you can also rely on your advocates to really forward the conversation about how to include communities of color and to push the companies if they're not doing it on their own. There's the power of tax revenue. We can use that for, we've seen states direct those funds from the occupancy taxes to homelessness and other goodwill efforts within the states and communities. So please rely on your advocates and also encourage these companies to include diverse individuals at the leadership level so that it's not last stage and adverse impacts to communities of color because there was no one of color making those decisions.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm going to kind of echo what some of my panel mates have mentioned. When you're starting up something as bold as Airbnb or a company like Lyft, I think everyone has a very aspirational view of what it's going to look like, and I know that that's what we had as well. But there always are going to be impacts that you don't expect, and I think the best way to make sure that A, you're addressing those, but B, also that you're doing a better job of expecting or predicting those is, to Stephanie's point, making sure that you have not only internal diversity, and diversity of thought, diversity of background, of experience, but also that you are building those partnerships on a local level, like Stephanie said, so that there is a direct feedback mechanism so that you can address issues as they arise. And it's one of the things, frankly, that you don't necessarily think about when you first launch a company. But if you are a company that's really trying to be thoughtful about this, then I would hope that pretty quickly you are starting to build up that aspect of your operations and that build up that chain of communication to make sure that if you can't predict everything, which no one can, then at least you can make sure that you're being thoughtful and able to respond to those things that come up.
So can I get a big round of applause for David, Stephanie, Joe, Susan?
Okay. Well, we are excited to continue the conversation here. I think this was the shortest break between panels maybe ever at a conference.
Stretch.
So I'm Jeff Tignor, the moderator of panel 2, and I think I will let our illustrious panel introduce themselves. I think what we may do is just jump right in with a question or two, and then as you answer the question, feel free to give some introduction as to who you are, your background, interest in the topics, and off we'll go. I just wanted to follow up some of the things that we just heard in the last panel, particularly some of the last things we heard from David about the project that's going on with the NAACP and looking at how Airbnb is trying to contribute to its local community. And that question is, how in general do you think that sharing economy companies can play a constructive role sort of in their local communities? We've heard a lot about how communities can differ and and just there are a lot of different considerations, whether across the world or even within the United States. But thinking about how this platform companies in this platform can make a real contribution to people that we've been discussing today. Jason, do you want to lead us off?
Sure, I'll get us started. And in that start, we want to introduce ourselves. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jason Green. I'm the co-founder of a workforce development technology company called SkillSmart. And prior to starting that, I served for 4 years as associate counsel to President Obama, and then got my start in community organizing and politics. And one of the things that struck me about the conversation that was happening immediately prior to us is the question of whose responsibility is it? We heard a lot of questions coming up about some of the regulatory policy, the way in which we engage with our labor communities, and some of the consequences that those relationships will create. The question becomes, whose responsibility is it to solve those problems? And actually, I don't have that answer. But when you talk about some of the companies that are participating in this gig economy, I think what we want them to say is that part of that responsibility is theirs. I don't want to say wholly that responsibility should be borne on their shoulders, but you want companies that are going to recognize that part of that responsibility is theirs, and to actually participate and sit at the table. The way that we see this in our work, SkillSmart serves really as a convener of the institutional players around the talent development process. Right? Our platform tries to rethink the way in which people get jobs. We start with the employer. We try and define that set of skill sets that an employer is looking for better and do a better job of signaling that into the marketplace. But then we also need to pull to the table job seekers and those organizations that support job seekers. In the same vein, we recognize that our training and development system may not have always equipped someone with all of the skill sets that they need. And so even though we take a new approach to evaluating talent, one based on skill sets, we recognize that some people still need some remediation and need some direction and clarity of pathway. And so we have to pull all these people together to address these particular needs. On their own, it's interesting when we see that none of the individual stakeholders sort of see this talent gap, skills gap, as their problem to solve, but they each has a consequence if it's not solved. And so trying to create a space where they can come together, all sing from the same song sheet and work productively in a direction, that's what I see as, that's the sort of company you want to participate in the gig economy.
Hi, my name is Kayla Horan. I'm an editor-in-chief of the Harvard Journal of Law and Technology. And as a journal, we read a lot of writing about what's currently going on in law and technology, but also a lot about the future and all the potential applications, things that could change things. So I'm here primarily to talk about blockchain technology and its potential applications in the sharing economy, and there are limitless potential applications, but we'll talk about a couple of examples. And I think the key that really ties into this question is that the key feature of blockchain technology is decentralization and the removal of any third party for verification or for connecting parties and creating that network. And because of that, this key function is platform cooperativism. So where users are both participants, contributors, and their shareholders. So ultimately, the idea there is for equitable distribution of value proportionate to what's actually being contributed within the network. And as we'll get into some of the examples a little bit later, you can see how that actually might function. But ultimately, that would be the goal, right, is to make the community the platform itself.
Great, thanks. I'm Sharon Block, and I'm the executive director of the Labor and Worklife program at Harvard Law School, which is a research, teaching, and policy center around, as the name suggests, the world of work. Prior to coming here to Harvard about 6 months ago, though, I spent almost all 8 years in the Obama administration in different labor policy positions, including running the policy office of the Department of Labor and doing labor policy in the White House. And so have actually had the opportunity to meet a lot of the folks doing policy at many of the sharing or gig economy. I mean, one thing I find really interesting about this space is vocabulary is really hard. Everybody has a different word for what this sector is, and which word you choose conveys different perspectives on the role of this sector. Talking about the people who earn income from these companies can also be challenging. If you call them employees, you've now suggested that you have a bias as to the outcome of one of the key policy questions. It's really awkward, though, to keep saying people who earn income from these companies, so I tend to say workers because they all work. But I think it's a really good question, and I would say, to me, the most important thing that I think, and in my previous job, and I hope in this job too, can engage the companies in the gig economy, the online sector, around the fact that it is a choice, the quality of jobs that they create. And I think there is what keeps, sort of to go back to the prior panel, what keeps me up at night is that I think there has been a rush to too quickly to find that the current legal protections for workers, especially low-wage workers, and we might have difference of opinions as to exactly why people do this work or how much they're making from it, but for the most part, the gig economy jobs are low-wage jobs. You're talking about drivers, cleaners, home care workers. And so I think thinking about the quality of jobs that this sector is creating is really important, and it is a choice. I don't think there's anything about the business model that necessarily drives towards status for these workers in which they don't have the basic protections that have been such an important part of building a middle class and protecting low-wage workers in this country. We can talk about this more, but I actually have a thing about Judge Cambria's description of the square peg into two round holes. I think the people who drafted our labor and employment protection laws were more creative than just to create two round holes. I think they're a lot more flexible, but we've moved in this dialogue very quickly to say, because this involves technology, it doesn't fit anymore. And I think that's a choice to some extent to create jobs that don't pay well, that aren't high quality jobs. And I think we should really think about that. And I think the companies have a responsibility to the communities in which they exist to really think about those choices.
Hello, my name is Jennifer Greigel, and I'm an assistant professor of communications specializing in social media at the S.I. Newhouse School of Public Communications at Syracuse University. That's a mouthful. But prior to that, I actually spent a long time here at Harvard Law School working with Professor Hal Scott with the Program on International Financial Systems and also with the Committee on Capital Markets Regulation. So I'm just really privileged to be in this space, and I'm happy to be back here. I became interested in kind of crowd-based work back when I learned about reCAPTCHA. And also when we're starting to look at products like MTurk, so maybe looking at even more micro-test information and jobs. So I realized when I was translating the New York Times for free for them that I had no idea that it was a part of that through these little squiggly lines called reCAPTCHA. And I was like, wow, that's a micro task. That's a micro job. And I'm not getting paid for that, recognized, or have access to the New York Times archive. So I got kind of annoyed. That case has made its way actually through Massachusetts labor law for anyone who wants to look at that. But then we have MTurk, where we have HITs, or called human intelligence tasks, and we're underpaying people in that space as well. So yeah, we should be looking at ride sharing and housing, but there's actually even more exploitation that's happening at a very micro level. So I was also looking forward to answering that question, what keeps me up at night, so I'm glad you did. So again, the idea that as we launch new products into the market, I feel like the new business model is to look at how can I exploit the most amount of people. So be it a Facebook that grows to 2 billion users and saying, hey, can everyone just flag and moderate our content for us because we're not going to pay you. Or a system where more and more people are brought into economies like, we'll say Airbnb and Lyft because we're here talking about them, but they can't actually participate in them because they don't have a house that somebody wants to rent out, and they don't have a car that they can drive around. So how do they get into those economies? And so I'd love to follow up with you, Kayla, because I'm actually here to talk a little bit about an app I've been trying to ideate and get some attention for, which is the idea that we all have time in hours, and I would love to see us start to do what's called time banking. This principle has been around for a long time, but I think that we're at a point with mobile technology and blockchain where we can actually start to transact between people, and people all have time. So that's something I want to put out there and talk a little bit about. Thank you.
Well, I think we should, instead of sort of delaying any further, let's talk about what some potential solutions are. I feel like we've sort of raised some potential problems with the sharing economy and some questions about how the modern economy is structured. But what are some potential solutions? I mean, I think Sharon, you had mentioned that we've moved away. The new jobs that are being created are jobs that tend to be maybe some of these low-wage jobs, but at the same time, we're not seeing probably as much manufacturing as much of some of the traditional jobs, and a lot of the jobs and interactions are based on sort of human-to-human connections, and with technology sort of in between. So how do we get, as somebody mentioned earlier, kind of how do we find a third way to work? How do we find a situation that is treats workers well, but also allows sort of new innovation and allows people who've been on the outside of the economy to have some additional opportunity?
No, it's a good question. And, I think, although I sort of come back to the fact that I think one thing we have to do is not to throw away the sort of structures that we've created to protect workers in this country so easily. So, I don't think that it is a given that our current sort of wage and hour laws, minimum wage, overtime, the sort of basic social safety net programs, it's not necessarily true that they can't fit in this new sector and continue to provide those protections. There are, in fact, as we talked about on the last panel, Seth Sternberg at Honor is building a successful business around having traditional employees. I think there are flexibilities built into the law that, because of the way our economy worked, were not explored and were not fully taken advantage of, but that the law can provide that. So I think that's one piece. Another thing I come back to, and I think the previous panel did a really good job talking about this, that I think there are different studies, and hopefully the Bureau of Labor Statistics is actually now, for the first time in 10 years, trying to measure the contingent workforce, so we'll know a lot more, and they've added questions to that part of their survey, so we'll know a lot more about the size, from really in a rigorous way, about the size of the sector, why workers are in the sector. But there's no doubt there are people doing this to fill in income, and part of that is because the economy, it just isn't working for too many people. It's a problem that people need to, on the weekends, be driving for Lyft or be driving for Uber or be renting out their homes because they have full-time jobs that don't provide a full-time living. So I think part of the answer, too, is just to make sure that there are other options for people, that work pays, so doing things like raising minimum wage, raising the overtime threshold, things like that, so that there are more options. There are some studies out showing that as the labor market now is starting to tighten, although we still have a problem with stagnating wages, that there is increased turnover on some of these platforms, suggesting that when people have options to have better paying, more stable kinds of work relationships, they actually opt for that. So they might say that they're driving for Uber or for Lyft or whatever out of a choice, when that choice includes employment that provides basic safety net protections, they'll take that over the flexibility or whatever of these other jobs. So I think there's no, I think we probably all agree there's no easy answers.
Jason, your thoughts, and then I will turn to a little bit more of the tech questions, but I want to.
Yeah, I'll jump in a little bit. I mean, I think part of what Sharon was saying there is that we're very nascent at this point. We're still sort of collecting some of this data, to your point about the contingent workforce and where BLS stands on it. And so we're having to, and I think this is also kind of where some of our gig economy companies were going, with Lyft and Airbnb sort of saying that, our focus in the first instance was how do we actually have a platform to do something, and then we can have that second conversation second. Whether that's right or wrong, I think we can debate, but I think that's how do you actually build a vibrant company? From my perspective, and I'm almost, in some respects, I'm a guy with a hammer, so everything I see is a nail, and it all kind of comes back to this conversation around, do we have complete information? You want to have better information about what the opportunities are that are out there. Like, what are the systems that exist for people to actually have that better information, to understand what jobs actually come with benefits and the requisite social safety net components? From our perspective, the system that allows those jobs to be matched is insufficient. Right? It's a job description and it's a resume. That's our system as it exists right now. How do you find out about jobs? Where do you actually go? Where do you know that you're going to find a quality job with good information about it? And so our company has tried to advocate for innovation in that space. How do you innovate on the job description? How do we find better systems to signal into the marketplace that there are other opportunities that can satisfy an individual or a family? And then on this question about information, it's also then to the individual worker. We've talked a lot about the disadvantaged communities being communities of color, but there are a lot of other communities that are also feeling being the titan right now. This is the disabled community. This is there's some ageism that's going on in the marketplace, if you had noticed. And so as people are preparing and reaching that retirement age, but know that they still have to work, where are those skills actually applicable, and where can they take them? Where can they transfer those skill sets? And so I think that's where part of the solution can be. Let's actually provide better information about what are the pathways to success.
Yes, Jen.
Maybe
go
I
ahead.
could jump in here.
Because I'm a big queer who also likes to hammer on things. So I would say, to follow on to that statement is that the people who are building a lot of these products are a lot of white guys. And when we look at venture capital, that's where the money is going. So somebody like me is going to be increasingly difficult to get people to kind of invest, to join teams. I want to make sure that when we're talking about barriers to access, so the people building these products are representative of all of us. I also want to highlight that the sharing economy right now has really shown that people want to work. Yay, us. We want to go to work. We need more opportunities to do that. So what I've been looking at is, again, this time banking model. And what I'm seeing is that we're having companies where the founders grow increasingly rich and wealthy with some of these billion-dollar company valuations that come to market. I mean, it's incredible. And it just seems that it's becoming concentrated wealth in these business models and these apps that are developed, and less about the people who are in these actual economies. So within time banking, the app that I'm proposing is called Swapper. And really what it is just facilitating people to share hours, to grow their local economies. And it's about the people in these platforms where the app is more running in the background, this decentralized idea. And we can log these hours in the blockchain. And it really becomes a person-to-person transaction. So these are some of the models that I would like to see come to market that really puts the user at the forefront, and it's less about those technical founders who are going to essentially go to market and spin it out and become billionaires. And it's this concentrated wealth that I'm really, really concerned about.
And if I could just add to that, that is the appeal, of course, of these decentralized networks, but it sort of is a double-edged sword because it does more to exacerbate the problem of the safety net and the employee benefits, right? If we're talking about, structurally, blockchain technology, it will turn the corporate form on its head when it's being utilized in the ways that people are imagining it right now. And if you have this true model of sharing proportionate to what you're producing within the network, then there is no one to make sure that you have that safety net. There is no CEO skimming off the top, and that increases the profit sharing, but it makes other problems a lot worse.
Can you give some examples of types of work that could fit with blockchain technology, or some types of work that could be effective and have community benefits and engage people but still be decentralized?
Absolutely. So I have sort of three main categories of examples that I'll run through really quickly. One would sort of be the home sharing model. So people have talked about ways that you can incorporate blockchain technology, but also the Internet of Things and all of the little smart home functions that you could have in your house into something like an Airbnb type platform, although it would be decentralized. So what it would sort of look like is you would be matching with the host yourself, and once the transaction goes through using blockchain, as it would with sort of Bitcoin or other types of cryptocurrency, and you may be paying in that other currency, but that's not important to this piece of it. Basically, everything in the house, anything that's on an internet connection can cooperate within the blockchain itself. So if you can have your locks automated to only open when that transaction has occurred and when the money is deposited into your account. You could further customize the experience by anything that you don't want your guests to use in the house that's connected to your Internet of Things. You will not work when they're in the house because you'll have that encoded into the blockchain. But anything you want them to use, like your Nest thermostat, would be. So, and then it would automatically lock at the end of the stay. And that's just one theoretical image of how that could look. Now, some of the pros is that the concept of a trustless network like this, where you don't have to know the person because the cryptography of the transactions themselves is what you're placing your trust in, could ultimately lead to a model that could actually reduce some of the bias and discrimination problems that we face in a platform like Airbnb. But it could create a lot more problems. I mean, in terms of the gentrification issue that we're talking about with Airbnb, it could only make things worse in that regard. If people are putting up these, fancy smart home Airbnbs, then people are going to want those, and not everyone can afford to install those in their house. And how are you going to compete with someone who has, this high-tech smart house on the market? So that's just one area. Another really interesting example is journalism. It's an area where I think the internet has sort of created this problem that no one's figured out how to solve yet, how to bring journalism into the new economy. And so there are a couple of models out there right now that are working on this. One is called Civil, another is called DNN, the Decentralized News Network. And their basic model is sort of like a journalism collective that works on the blockchain. So you could participate in any number of ways simultaneously as a reader, a writer, a reviewer, maintaining the actual website and operations, anything like that. Any type of participation would earn you tokens within this network and this economy that you could then use any way that you want to support the type of content that you are enjoying and reading. And the moderation functions, what Jen was referring to in terms of Facebook getting free labor, that's something that you would earn tokens for by reviewing things. And it's, the major pro obviously is the democratization of news, right? We're not relying on institutions to provide this. We're relying on the community itself to engage and determine what is fake news and what's not, right? But we do have a lot of cons there, and that goes back to the time as a resource, right? Some of these examples are not areas that could ever be a primary source of income. And if it's not time that you're investing in hopes of gaining a primary source of income or even a significant source of income, then it might not be time that you actually have at all to engage in this. And then are we creating tiers of society where people have access to filtered news and community-based news, and then we're actually worsening that divide in other areas. And then just another really quick example is social media. There are some examples already running right now. Akasha, Steamio, Scenario, these are all social networks running on the blockchain where you would pay a microtransaction to actually post on the network, but earn it back as your content is distributed and reviewed by your peers. And you could also similarly earn tokens by, reviewing, moderating content, helping to maintain the network itself. And that, has the pros of decentralization. It will remove the disparate impact of surveillance that affects communities of color using current social networking, and would remove ad tracking and all these other behaviors that can have those disproportionate impacts. But on the con, it would also create another potential for tiers of society, especially in terms of privacy inequality, right? Because then you have people who can afford to pay whatever microtransactions are necessary. And this, again, it's the known unknowns here. We don't know what this is going to actually look like. We don't know how bad these problems will be or if they'll be better. But you'll have people who can afford to pay for privacy and those who can't.
We very much live in that world. As somebody who teaches at a journalism school, I can agree with that. And I think it's also just incredibly important to say that we already live in such a tiered society. And when we look at things like verification online, there's really, if we're looking at blockchain as a technology that can leverage, we can leverage by verifying our real identities online. And there's only a certain class of people who can do that. You can be a celebrity, politician. You have to be famous essentially to get Twitter verified. And these social networks have really shown who they care about. And I think when we're talking about journalism and blockchain, we need to flag that and also use it for ways to verify the information that's on there. You mentioned fake news very quickly. That's the elephant in the room right now. And we have the tech there. And I think that there's these companies, they may be investigating it, but they may also be incentivized to steer clear of this. We can put big financial institutions in this bucket as well.
If I could just add on that a little bit, I think you brought up, Jen, in the previous panel, the role of venture capital, and to the extent that these models that you were talking about are ways of getting around the sort of venture capital world. I think in the work that I've done around this sector, it became, maybe I was naive, but it was surprising to me and became very apparent what a powerful role venture capital has in setting these business models specifically around the choice between having a W-2 and a 1099 business model, and all of the incentives to drive explosive growth and quick returns drive, again, sort of underscore those choices. And so I think that that's an important piece. And I think it was said on the previous panel about sort of the corporate social responsibility community only coming in when companies get to be big or a certain size. It's really hard to turn those big ships then. And so when you've got a business model that has baked into it a 1099 business model, it's hard. There are, Honor did it, there are companies that have done it, but it is a really important role. And I think there are certain, that drives towards different policy options around reporting and things like that that can change incentives.
And if I could quickly add on also, the blockchain is not a godsend. It doesn't solve all of these problems, and that's another area where it actually wouldn't. I was surprised to find there's another company called Lazuz. It's an Israeli tech startup that uses blockchain-based technology to do ride sharing. They're not fully operational yet, but what they have people doing is if you drive around running their app, then you're actually earning tokens within this system that you can then use to pay for rides later. But they're hoping that that will be the model, and people can pay with their own driving time essentially, or pay with money if you'd rather just do that. But that's another area where I was reading an interview by the founders, and they were talking about how much of their own capital they had to put up to do this, because it's not actually a way around the venture capital world. You still have to design an app and do all these things that are going to get people involved in it. And it's just another area where the barrier to access is high. Once someone goes ahead and creates one of these decentralized networks that you can participate in, that's fantastic. But starting your own with your own idea is something where the barrier to access is still going to be high.
I think that's what we talk about. We really need systemic change. To Sharon's point about the amount of dollars that are being invested, I think it's something like 55% of venture dollars, if not more, are housed in 3 locations. We're in one of them, New York, and then broadly California, the Valley, and then down to LA. And in my world of sort of the job space, you start to see the way in which jobs get aggregated. 70% of jobs go to people in your network. You're not applying to this job. It's never posted on even into the space. That's why I advocate so much for better information and stronger signaling. Those jobs are never made broadly available, and so we talk often about sort of the last third of the conversation, the last tenth of the conversation, but so much of it is sort of undergirded in our system, the way in which we finance things, where the venture capital is coming from, how the structures come from. And so when we think about how we're actually going to both embrace the opportunity of the gig economy, but steer it so it's the most inclusive and has the most opportunity for the most people, I think we really need to think about some of those structural systems.
Well, that was one of the topics that David and I were discussing when we were trying to put this together, which is how can we avoid bringing inequalities from the current economic system forward into the new economy. And I hear from what you guys are saying on the tech solutions that maybe blockchain is a part of that. Of course, at that point, to be able to even participate in that, you're going to have to be, at this point, a fairly sophisticated consumer, have a good amount of access to technology, be willing to sort of trust people. So how do we get to that point, which seems like maybe a fair way of doing journalism and a way of engaging people in the community, but how do we get from where we are now to that point where people can have that level of trust with technology and also still have a safety net? It just seems like the solution sounds like the technological solution is pretty far from where we are right now.
Yeah, so I think the various models actually create different answers to that, right? So something like Lazuz, you don't really need a whole lot of tech sophistication to use it. If someone says, hey, you can get free rides if you just run this app on your phone that you already use for everything else while you're driving, and that's simple enough that I think a lot of people would be willing to buy into it if it's already a product that they're interested in using. Whereas something like the more traditional application of blockchain is through cryptocurrency, and that's most people have heard of Bitcoin and not other things with this. With Bitcoin, you do need a fairly large amount of technological sophistication to participate, and it's about the different mechanism for actually verifying the transactions, right? So to use cryptocurrency, you have to be running a fairly powerful computer, and your computer is doing work that allows you to participate in this network. Whereas other models use something other than that computational work to allow participation or to verify participation in the network. So the answer is that it will look different in different applications. But I think that the barrier of just trusting technology is something that people don't know how to resolve as society at large, right? Is just how to make my grandmother use an iPad because it would be easier on her eyes, things like that. I'm not sure that we have the answers to.
Maybe I can just jump in here. I am growing increasingly kind of skeptical of also rhetoric around this new app is going to help us. This new technology is going to save us. We can automate everything. We can just use artificial intelligence. I think we really need to slow down as a society and think about not only how computers are mediating not only more of our communication between each other, but our relationships between each other. And I know recently I have slowed down. I've talked to my neighbors more. I've hung out with my family more. I visited a bunch of people in Cambridge today. And let me tell you, people are wonderful. And let's just, as we're all sitting here nerding out about the new tech, not forget that we need each other, and we need humans, and we need more humans working at these platforms, and we need to be present with each other. And so as I'm thinking about the next big blockchain app that I'm going to maybe work with Kayla over here, because she seems pretty smart, I want to also remember that we have to consider our relationships in real life with each other. It's really important. And I'm really glad to be here with you guys in person.
I couldn't agree more. I was going to say, Jeff, to your question, that I'm not sure that it is a technological answer or solution. I think piggybacking on that point, it's a relationship. It's a social answer. Technology will continue to drive our economy and change the way in which we work and interact. But I think it's conversations like this that are going to dictate the way in which we, innovate on some of that technology. I think we need to have a conversation around what sort of community we want, around what sort of companies we want. If Lyft or Airbnb were told in forceful ways how the community wanted to interact with them, with time, they would certainly, they are. The fact that they're here, they're engaging, right? I give them a lot of credit. But we as a community need to have some clarity around what we want and speak towards that.
Please.
One way that traditionally workers have done that and engaged in that conversation was obviously through unions, through the labor movement. And one of the effects of sort of choosing these business models where workers aren't employees is that they've lost that right to join unions and to have a voice together in a way. So that's a lot of the work that I'm doing, is looking at new ways that workers are organizing themselves in order to have a voice, to have power in that relationship. It's wonderful. We should all care about each other, but it's also a matter of leverage and power within the economy. And if workers are forced to engage with their employers or the people who own the places where they earn income, one by one, that's going to be a very one-sided conversation. And so it's the community having a voice, but it's also workers together having a voice and finding new ways to do that. Maybe I can just jump in quick. Someone had mentioned Senator Mark Warner and kind of engaging our politicians and our elected officials. I cannot underscore that enough because I would like to see us kind of thinking about some of our old employment contract law and some of our, in the field of communications, like broadcast law and how that could be applied in social media world. I feel like so much of what we're seeing now is this rush to market, and then we think about regulation after the fact, and our regulations are not keeping up with the pace of change. And I think we're going to hit this tipping point where it's just we can't roll things back. And I know when I think about the world I want to participate in and help construct, we have to consider regulation in that. So I think it's really important that you're bringing that up.
Jason, Kayla. I think maybe I was going to bring up a question on regulation, so Sharon, I think it's great that you raised that. I wanted to just know if you had any thoughts on that, what the role of government and regulation might be, as we try to, sort of move forward as a community and get closer to some companies and technology that speak to what people want. Then I thought we'd try to leave about 15 minutes for questions, so we can also engage some of the folks who are on the first panel.
Sure. I mean, I think, not surprisingly, that it is it's a very tip of the knife conversation around regulation, because we know that we want business, we want to stimulate, and so I think one of the ways that regulation or Washington can play a very active role in this space is to go back to the world where government believed in innovating and investing in innovation and sort of setting out a clear vision for the direction in which our innovation should go. I think we heard from the previous panel that there's obviously some concern around overregulation and what that does to a business as it's trying to grow. So I think we and I would love for Sharon's response about this. We as a community need to decide what it is that we want. We want a business that is going to conduct far-ranging business in every escape of the work that we're doing, or do we want a business that's sort of regulated into particular segments of the community? I mean, I think that's fine. Either are fine. I think what we're not doing enough of is actually engaging in the conversation to then dictate to our elected officials or our policymakers around the direction that we want to go. And I think, in part, I imagine a lot of people don't feel like they actually have the agency there. They don't have the information and the guidance to participate. And so we need to figure that piece out too. What are the right forums for someone who is being affected by their communities? Actually, we're talking about gentrification, right? Like what's the right forum for that community to actually have a conversation around what that community should look like? Whether the role that Airbnb is playing, at least in our conversations, is actually driving that, or if it's other factors that are happening in the community, and what do we want, where are those people going to go? Like, we're not having a gentrification conversation. We're having a conversation about a business and assuming that that's what's driving it. But we need to have that broader conversation and then put that in its appropriate place. Then the regulatory framework can be built around it.
Yeah, I would agree. I think some of the employment issues, I think, would probably require a little bit more work at the national level to sort of keep up with these changes. But I would echo the first panel, and maybe it's just being converted by the Susan Crawford school of thought on cities and regulatory matters at the local level. But I do think I would echo the first panel that it's we shouldn't be looking for a one-size-fits-all solution when we're talking about how to actually integrate these new technologies and new business models with the needs of the communities that we're talking about.
I feel compelled to say something. Having spent the past few years deeply engaged in the regulatory process at the federal level. And I can just tell you, I mean, our approach, and it's a sensitive subject, having spent 8 years building what we thought were thoughtful regulations, and now in 8 months seeing many of them dismantled. I think the community, the regulatory process, when it is done correctly, is a place for the community to have a voice. I mean, we did, I'm sure there are people in the room who might disagree whether we always came out, and I have a little pronoun problem. I still say we when I talk about what we did in the Obama administration, but we did engage sort of every group of stakeholders. We spent, when we did the overtime regulation, we actually I went with Secretary Perez to Silicon Valley to talk about, get views on their views, both workers in the gig economy, CEOs, venture capitalists, what was their view? Where did we need to go? What were the sort of outer limits? Understanding what our values were, but how do you navigate some of those different interests? We did regulations like the overtime regulation. We got hundreds of thousands of comments, and I can tell you that there were human beings, not real human beings, not even mechanical Turkers, like real lawyers and policy people who read every single one. It's an amazing process to see all of that information synthesized. So, again, when it is done right, which it isn't always, and I think we'll see examples, we have already seen examples when the regulatory system is not not done well. It should be a place where all different parts of the community have a voice.
I think just on the regulatory front, just noting that some of the regulatory fines, for example, that a Facebook might face are such small slaps on the wrist that it doesn't really change their behavior. And I guess just some of my observations in the regulation space, like we're seeing some leadership overseas, and we have to remember that these companies are global, and regulations, as some people on the first panel noted, are at the local country level often. And I just can't help but see that, like, these companies have gotten so big, some of them, that I'm not sure even the regulations that are in place are actually having any actual impact on them. And it just feels a little bit like an out-of-control train to me. So I hope that regulators not only will pass thoughtful legislation and regulations, but they will actually look at the enforcement side of something that's meaningful enough for Facebook and large companies especially to take seriously.
Right. And with that, let's open the floor to some questions and continue the try to continue the conversation a little bit. Yes, correct, for either panel. So many of our panelists, panel one, are still around.
Hello, my name is Kevin Simon. I'm a graduate student down at MIT. And my question actually comes back to a word that was brought up in the previous panel, the hustle economy. And I think it's generally agreed upon that we don't want most people to be in the hustle economy, having to work weekends, having to work late nights, having to work unpleasant overtime in order to close the bills. But the other half of the modern economy is globalization. And there's many forces at a global scale that are moving people into the hustle economy right outside of the US. The majority, outside of the US and Europe, the majority of the economy is participating in the hustle economy. So my question is, as we see in America, more people are moving into this hustle economy. Do we believe that it is this gig economy, this shared economy, whatever you want to call it, that is causing that transition of more people into the hustle economy, or is it more a symptom of that transition, in your opinion?
I think it's much more of a symptom. I mean, I think as the first panel talked about, the gig economy is still really, really small. Again, hopefully we'll have a better estimate soon, but the most, I think the most reliable data was Larry Katz here at Harvard and Alan Kruger at Princeton, who, it's probably almost 2 years ago now, came up with numbers that showed it's, I think, less than 1% of all US workers are in the gig economy. What is that really big piece of the economy, again, is what was talked about on the first panel, which is this contingent work. And that is really driving the suppressing wage. I mean, there's lots of factors that's suppressing wages, but I think there is a really good argument that move to contingent work. A colleague of mine from Department of Labor, who's now at Brandeis, David Weil, wrote this book, The Fishered Economy, about how you're breaking apart and attenuating employment relationships between companies and workers and putting a lot more layers between sort of the big what we used to think of as sort of the big mothership corporation through staffing agencies, temporary work, subcontracting. That all creates more sort of competition on wages, which competition between those different pieces of that fishered workplace, which drive down wages. But we're in a decades long before anybody had a dream about Lyft or Uber or whatever, was this really long period of wage stagnation began. So it's clearly a much, much bigger phenomenon.
Maybe I can just jump in on that too, because Swapper, the app I'm kind of ideating, is based on Ithaca hours, which is the longest running local currency in the United States. It's been around since the 90s, and kind of was originally kind of founded because there wasn't enough kind of like extra work or enough income for people to go out and go to like the movies or like take somebody out on a date, and they just needed some more fun money. And so they could essentially create a small local economy where they could transact with each other and then go to the farmer's market and buy a loaf of bread and things like that. But I think that intention is good, and all of us would probably like participate in making a little extra cash and a little hustle on the side. But it's what's happened with these apps is that I think they're starting to push us in a direction where it's not just like a casual thing, and it's becoming like it's breaking up the nature of kind of long-term traditional work, and it's becoming the primary source, and we have to kind of start piecing it together, and that's not ideal. I think most people would prefer a full-time job with benefits, and then if you need a little vacation money, then you supplement, but it's not supplemental anymore is what I'm starting to see because of these apps.
David?
So, thanks. Jason, you used a phrase, and I think this really is directed to all the kind of corporate panelists. You spoke of the need to kind of be able to establish a vibrant concern, ongoing concern. And my question is kind of how we define vibrancy in that sense. Excuse me. Is it margins? Is it service? Is it sustainability? So this idea that we have to kind of make a vibrant, ongoing concern before we can do some things. What makes it vibrant, and when do kind of just if you could speak to that, please.
Sure. I'll tee it up, and if any of the first panelists want to join in. I mean, I think the point I was trying to make is that when you're ideating your idea, the reality is often, particularly when you're a first mover, and reaching some of the heights that some of the companies that are here, the social consequences and sometimes even the social benefits may not be the primacy of your concern. Instead, you're trying to achieve the market share that your business is created to try and create. Airbnb, recognizes, though their motto is to, make a home for everyone, they wanted to have a platform people could make their homes, a business and profitable earning enterprise. I think as that grows, you start to recognize some of the social consequences and social benefits that you as a company, if that wasn't your initial profit margin or business model, those come to rise up and you start to address them. I think that's part of why I mentioned that the community plays a really important role in navigating and helping to dictate what that North Star is. That's what I mean. So the vibrancy of a platform, sometimes when you're saying, look, we want to exist. We want to be a platform that can stand on its own 2 feet. Part of the difficulty in answering the question is that there's so many different models. That might be you want to get to a point where you are venture backed and now you can speak with a full, throated voice, or you've reached a level of contracting that you're sustainable and taking on employees. Just trying to put myself in the mind of a young entrepreneur that's trying to build a sustainable, vibrant business, that there will be different levers and different priorities that they have to set out for that business to sustain itself so that you can have some of the broader social conversation. Now, there are a whole host of different types of businesses, right? There are social ventures who in their forefront, in their primacy of their business model, they don't do well and can't reach levels of vibrancy or sustainability unless they're also achieving in sort of some of those social ventures. So it's just trying to figure out what it is that you're trying to achieve, what you're providing this platform into the space that people can do things on, and then, oh, by the way, look at all these other consequences that come along with it. Sometimes that's just the realistic life cycle of a business. I think part of what the community's responsibility is and the opportunities of technology is to continue to iterate and ideate upon that. Right? There are opportunities for a sort of simple and generic platform that has significant positive or negative social consequences to be changed. Part of the process is actually going through that.
I could build on that a little bit. There's a great book out now that I would recommend by Rick Wartzman. He's a journalist who's at the Wall Street Journal and the LA Times. It's called The End of Loyalty. And he looks at sort of 4 iconic American corporations and traces sort of their business models from post-World War II to today and looking at how those business models have changed. And one of the sort of theses that he has is that there's been a big shift, and you can sort of you can substitute different words to sort of get the point, but there's been a shift from a stakeholder vision of capitalism to a shareholder vision of capitalism, and that there were certain social and political reasons why post-war these big companies really thought about how they were sustaining the communities. So the companies are GE, Coke, Kodak, and I'm missing one. But companies you would recognize as having really built relationships in their communities, really contributed to their communities, and that for most of them that really changed. But I think that is something at the Department of Labor we really thought a lot about, is how do you communicate about a stakeholder vision? And from our perspective, what were the policies, the sort of regulations and and statutes that were driving this change from thinking about the corporation's role in terms of its stakeholders to being so focused on shareholders. But instead of shareholders, you can say venture capitalists or founders or whatever. But that different relationship to the communities and the other stakeholders that they interact with.
And when we say shareholders, we have to really keep in mind that that's institutional investors. Okay, that's not like you and I buying single shares of stock, because there are initiatives, at least in Twitter too, where people are trying to actually exert some public governance over these types of companies and be engaged in the governance of them. But some of these big public companies are traded in block trades, and they could be being traded by large companies that have activist mentalities and maybe not in line with the original vision of the company. And there can be a lot of drift when it comes to a corporation. So I just wanted to underscore that.
Before I go, because I always had a question, I just want to make sure that anyone who's hesitating, it doesn't just come on up. Okay.
You speak for them all.
So here's the, so I'm an anachronism right before you. I'm a UAW member. So when I always think about, I'm an attorney, what does that mean? So what it really means is power. Really, that's what being a union member means. But it's it's an anachronism, let's be honest. But so in the new world, where are people getting their power? In fact, if you Google independent contractor, can an independent contractor, Google fills in unionize as the fourth word that if you Google that phrase. So people are asking themselves, how do I get more power? And one of the things that I think about is using means of communication, pulling together, pushing back. For example, we heard, and I'm not putting you on the spot, but we heard earlier, if you're not on our doing the thing we want you to do, Airbnb says, out of here. Well, what does that person have any rights to push back? Say, no, I was fine, I did my right. Someone gave me a bad review, someone told me wrong, but now I'm completely pushed off the platform. The same thing with Lyft and Uber. People get bad reviews, You talk to drivers, they are fearful of getting pushed off the platform. And they have very few rights to push back. So just the question really is, is technology going to help us pull together and create platforms so we can push back?
I think that is one area where this sort of, dream of blockchain is supposed to sort of assuage some of those concerns. Because if they are almost all in theory based around this idea of reputation within the community and the network, right? But the difference being you are evaluating everyone in your community and they're evaluating you at the same time. And a lot of these models actually don't even, they base it on how well your reviews align with the rest of the community's reviews and not necessarily just the content of the reviews themselves, which I think is an important and interesting way to incentivize a certain type of honesty and feedback. But I think that is the vision, right? Is that you have the reputation and reviews within the community, but not any other body or bureaucracy or third party then evaluating that and verifying that. And I think that creates a lot of solutions, but also could potentially create a lot of problems at the same time. And it's sort of the Wild West and all in theory right now, but it would be interesting to see how that plays out as a potential solution.
There are also new forms of worker organizations that are springing up. I mean, in Seattle, that's been tied up in litigation, but Seattle did pass an collective organizing, collective bargaining regime for transportation network company drivers. So we'll see how that works. There's also an experiment going on in New York, again, with Uber and Lyft drivers. There are online platforms like coworker.org, which are experimenting and starting to drive, have had some successes with companies like Starbucks and American Airlines, where it's an online place for workers who work for these big companies all over the country, all over the world, to come together and express their collective grievances. They obviously don't have the protection of the law that the way that traditional private sector workers and some now still public sector workers have. But I think there is a lot of innovation. I'm actually going to be teaching a class in the spring at the law school on new forms of worker organization and looking at how some of these different models are working, who they're working for, trying to think of, for one, just to share that there is a lot of interesting work. I mean, somebody brought up National Domestic Workers Alliance, which has moved domestic worker bills of rights in many states now, something that, people who were completely left out of our collective bargaining law now have those rights, some of which some people might think are superior to what you have under the National Labor Relations Act. So there is some interesting, nobody's achieved the scale, obviously, that the labor movement has, which is still 14 million people. But I think it's really important to see that there is some experimentation and new forms coming along.
And I think the existing labor movement, has a real relevant place. I mean, we might need to innovate on some of those models, but we shouldn't. I don't think the point here is that we're throwing out the old, right? Where there's new, these are additive, and so there's we want people at the table. We want more people at the table.
All right. I think this is our last question here. No, that's all right.
My name is Adam Zalkowski. I'm actually a public high school teacher. I teach high school economics and history. My question is, and no one's an educator, I think, on the panels, but what would you tell me as a high school history teacher? What would you tell policymakers in education? How can, you said new economy, Jeff, how can we prepare these high school kids for the new economy? And I split the high school kids up into two groups, say the kids that graduate high school, go to a four-year university, go into the professional world, and then also the kids that are sort of getting left behind as we've cut out a lot of vocational education. These are the kids that end up going into like the gig economy or the hustle economy. How can we take the things that you all are talking about and translate it into things that teachers can do better or school systems can do better? And I say that knowing that not anyone necessarily is in the education business. Thank you.
Well, one of the things that I realize I'm not even a panelist, but I'll take a crack at saying something about this question. One of the things that I think is so important, as we've sort of touched on the last election a little bit, is just having students who are prepared to understand sort of what they're seeing online, being able to evaluate, look at different sources, compare them, look at different options. And I think that applies to people who might be working, as you described, in the gig economy versus people who are going on to graduate school. I think it might be, a natural for people who are, maybe a little, younger than any of us here on the panel. But still, I think just evaluating what you're seeing, sort of being critical about it, and sort of thinking about the context of social media and various sources. I mean, that strikes me as something that could be, very important to whatever the work is going to be, sort of over the next, say, 30 years.
Yeah. Maybe I can jump in here because I actually was a high school teacher at one point. I taught fine arts guys, and now I teach at the university level. And if you can't tell, I'm a little bit of a dreamer. I can't help myself. But one thing that frustrated me in high school going into liberal arts school, which somebody mentioned at one point, was that I didn't know what to do yet when I was in high school. And I grew up in a small rural town in upstate New York. And then I went to college, and I still was not sure what I wanted to do. And I knew about old-timey work programs like apprenticeships, and I was just like, wow, it would be really cool if I was being trained technically for a job that I could go into and go work for a company, and they would want to hire me because I had those skills. And so that was something that stuck with me, and I'm actually piloting a new style of class at Newhouse, which is modeled on an internship in a classroom and also on apprenticeships. So I have a partnership with the big publisher BuzzFeed, so maybe you guys have taken some of those lists and quizzes. Well, I actually co-teach with them at Newhouse. Newhouse. And they come into my classroom, and our students create lists, quizzes, they learn the technology, the CMS, and then they go on and they end up publishing content that gets promoted to the homepage of BuzzFeed.com, and it gets millions of views. It's crazy. And then we connect them with the HR team, and then we try and help to place them. And I was like, wow, I wish I could go back to school and take a class like this, right? But I think that we need to also, as educators, make sure that we're training students with the skills that companies need and want, and knowing that there's actually quite a large skill gap there, especially in social media and new media, because you often have to go into the company to get trained. So we have to really be, I think, forming some partnerships, at least in higher education, but maybe even in high schools too.
And stole my word, skills. I mean, I think what you want to be doing is providing your students with exposure, opportunities to understand what's happening in the workplace, recognizing, though, that, of course, this is all going to change. And I think that's okay. I think what we're trying to do is invest in systems that can't predict what the jobs of the future will be, but if we can have a system that's responsive enough, that gives good information, that can tell you what those skill sets are so that you can incorporate that into your curriculum and prepare your students. But I think just recognizing that it's going to be a skills-based economy, we're talking about the sort of the disaggregation of everything right now, the disaggregation of work, the disaggregation of education. And so if you're equipping your students with the ability to understand what skills are, that they themselves can also be a collection of skills and experiences, that they can then go and amass new ones as the requirements continue to change. I think that's just equipping them for the dynamism of a future economy.
Thank you, Adam. I think that's a great question to end on. Yeah. Thank you. That's great. And we can hang around. Those of us in the room can hang around. There's a reception 2 doors down. Thank you very much for coming today.